On a rainy night, a lonely billionaire finds a lost boy on the road without memory and full of fear. What seemed like a simple act of compassion soon turns into a dark puzzle when a DNA test reveals a shocking connection between the two. Trying to unravel the mystery, he discovers that someone has worked tirelessly to hide the truth, and that his own family might be behind it. But the biggest threat doesn't come from the past, but from the present. Someone will do anything to ensure this secret is never revealed. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The rain mercilessly battered the windshield of the Bentley as Richard Morgan drove down the deserted road leading to his mansion on the outskirts of New York. The digital clock read 11:45 p.m., and the only sounds filling the interior of the luxurious vehicle were the drumming of raindrops and the occasional thunder that split the dark sky. Richard was known in the business world as the Emperor of Silicon Valley, not just for his estimated billions in fortune, but mainly for the coldness with which he conducted his negotiations. At 55, his imposing figure and penetrating gaze were his trademark in board meetings, where his words were law and his decisions irrevocable. That night, he was returning from another successful acquisition, biotech. A promising biotechnology startup had finally yielded to his proposal after months of intense negotiations. It was another victory for his empire, another step on his ladder to the absolute top of the market. Suddenly, a movement at the roadside caught his attention. For a moment, he thought he saw a small figure running between the trees. Richard slowed down, more out of caution than real interest. That's when his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on the brakes. A child. A boy who appeared to be no more than 6 years old was standing on the shoulder of the road. His soaked clothes clung to his small body, and his frightened eyes reflected the headlights like those of a cornered animal. Richard was paralyzed for a few seconds, his brain trying to process this surreal scene. "My God," he muttered, turning off the car and grabbing his umbrella. As he got out of the vehicle, the force of the storm nearly wrenched the object from his hands. The boy didn't move, only trembled more intensely. "Hey, kid," called Richard, approaching cautiously. "Where are your parents?" The boy just shook his head, his lips trembling from cold and fear. His clothes were not just wet, but also muddy, as if he had fallen or crawled on the ground. "Are you hurt?" asked Richard, crouching down to be at the child's height. The boy again didn't answer, but his eyes. There was something in those eyes that touched Richard in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. The rain continued to fall torrentially, and increasingly close thunder indicated that the storm was worsening. Richard knew he couldn't leave the child there. He looked around, searching for any sign of a house or car, but there was only darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. "Come," he said finally, extending his hand. "I'll take you to a safe place." To his surprise, the boy accepted his hand without hesitation. His small hands were ice cold, and Richard felt a strange pang in his chest. He led him to the car, helping him into the back seat. Inside the vehicle, under the interior light, Richard could observe the child better. There was something familiar about his features, something he couldn't quite define. The boy had dark brown hair and honey-colored eyes, a combination that awakened in Richard an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu. "What's your name?" he tried again, turning on the car's heater. The boy hugged his own knees, curling up on the leather seat. "Lucas," he whispered after a long silence. "Lucas," repeated Richard, trying to keep his voice soft, something he wasn't used to doing. "I'm Richard. I'm going to help you, okay?" As he drove towards his mansion, Richard couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. The boy had fallen asleep, exhausted, and his face relaxed in sleep revealed an innocence that contrasted drastically with the state in which he had been found. Richard took out his cell phone, thinking of calling the police, but something made him hesitate. A strange feeling, almost a premonition, made him put the device back in his pocket. First, he would take the boy home, give him hot food and dry clothes. Then he would think about what to do. Little did he know that this seemingly simple decision was about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of everything he knew as truth. The empire he had built so carefully, the relationships he kept under rigid control, all the secrets carefully buried over the years. Everything was about to come to light, starting with that small encounter on a stormy night. The gates of the Morgan mansion opened automatically as the Bentley approached. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, but the air was still charged with electricity. Richard parked in front of the main entrance where Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for more than 3 decades, was already waiting for him with a worried expression. "Mr. Richard, is everything—" She interrupted her sentence upon seeing the sleeping boy in the back seat. "Good Lord. Mrs. Thompson, prepare a hot bath and set aside some clothes. I think there might be something of Peter's that will fit him," ordered Richard, referring to his niece's son, who occasionally stayed at the mansion. Carefully so as not to wake him, Richard carried Lucas inside. The boy barely moved, completely exhausted. Under the light of the entrance hall, the boy's features seemed even more familiar, provoking in Richard a growing unease. "Where did you find this child?" asked Mrs. Thompson, following them up the stairs. "On the road alone, soaked, he can barely speak," replied Richard, his voice betraying a concern he rarely showed. Mrs. Thompson quickly prepared one of the guest rooms while Richard tried to gently wake Lucas. The boy opened his eyes, disoriented for a moment, but showed no fear. "We're going to give you a bath and then you'll eat something, okay?" said Richard, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. While Mrs. Thompson took care of Lucas, Richard went to his office and started making calls. First to his lawyer, then to some contacts in the police. No one had a record of missing children matching Lucas's description in the last 24 hours. "Sir?" Mrs. Thompson's voice interrupted him. "The boy is clean and fed. I managed to make him eat some soup." Richard nodded, standing up. "Did he say anything?" "Almost nothing, but—" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, wringing her hands in her apron. "There's something you need to see." In the room, Lucas was sitting on the king-size bed, looking even smaller amidst the white sheets. He was wearing one of Peter's blue pajamas, which was a bit big on him. His hair, damp from the bath, was combed back, and that's when Richard saw it. Behind the boy's right ear was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Richard felt his blood run cold. He knew that mark. It was identical to the one his younger sister, Hannah, had in the same place. Hannah, who had left 20 years ago after a terrible fight with the family. "Mr. Richard?" Mrs. Thompson called him, worried about his sudden paleness. "Everything's fine," he replied automatically, but his mind was racing. "Mrs. Thompson, call Mrs. Morgan. Tell her I need to speak to her urgently." Margaret Morgan, his mother, still lived in the family's main house just a few miles away. At 78, she remained lucid and in control of many aspects of the family business, especially the most delicate ones. "At this hour, sir?" asked Mrs. Thompson, hesitant. "Yes, now," confirmed Richard, his voice leaving no room for discussion. While he waited, Richard sat in the armchair near the bed. Lucas observed him with curiosity, but still without speaking. There was something in the boy's gaze that reminded him so much of Hannah, the same intensity, the same depth. "Lucas," he called softly, "do you know a lady named Hannah?" The boy's eyes widened for a moment, and Richard realized he had touched on something important. But before he could insist, Lucas closed up again, hugging his knees against his chest. Richard's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from his mother. "Don't meddle in this, Richard. Leave the past where it is." The cryptic message only served to confirm his suspicions. His mother knew something, and that boy was somehow connected to Hannah's disappearance. "Mrs. Thompson," he called, "stay with him. I'm going to sort out a few things." In the hallway, Richard picked up the phone again, this time dialing another number. After 3 rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Dr. Sanders, I'm sorry for the hour, but I need an urgent favor. Yes, it's about a DNA test. No, it can't wait until tomorrow." As he hung up, Richard looked out the hallway window. The storm had passed, but the sky remained overcast, starless. Just like his own life, which had always seemed so clear and organized, was now plunged into shadows and doubts. The businessman who had always prided himself on having total control over his life and business now found himself facing a mystery that threatened to unearth long-buried secrets. And, for the first time in many years, Richard Morgan felt afraid. of what he might discover. Morning arrived with a dense fog covering the mansion's gardens. Richard hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between his office and visits to the room where Lucas was resting. The boy slept deeply, as if he hadn't rested for days. At 7 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Dr. Sanders, a discreet forensic genetics specialist, arrived carrying his briefcase. Richard personally led him to Lucas's room. "I need the results as quickly as possible," instructed Richard, watching the doctor collect a saliva sample from the still sleepy boy. "And absolute discretion." "As always, Mr. Morgan," replied the doctor. "I'll have the preliminary results in 24 hours. After the doctor's departure, Richard received another visit, this one much less expected. Margaret Morgan, his mother, entered the mansion like a gust of icy wind. Even at 78, her presence still commanded respect and in some cases fear. "Where is he?" she asked without preamble, her astute eyes examining her son. "Good morning to you too, Mother," replied Richard, maintaining his composure. "Want some coffee?" "Don't come at me with ironies, Richard. You're meddling in something dangerous." Richard led his mother to his office, closing the door behind them. Dangerous? A little boy lost in the rain is dangerous? Or is it the fact that he has the same birthmark as Hannah? Margaret sat stiffly in one of the leather armchairs. "Your sister made her choices a long time ago. Leave the past where it is." "What choices, Mother? Because to this day, no one has explained to me exactly what happened. Hannah simply disappeared after that fight with Dad, and you acted as if she had never existed." The Morgan matriarch adjusted the pearl brooch on her impeccable tailored suit, a gesture that Richard knew well. It was her nervous tic. "There are things it's better not to know, my son. Your sister, she threatened to expose secrets that would destroy our family." "What secrets?" insisted Richard, leaning forward. "No." Margaret slammed her hand on the armchair's arm. "I won't allow you to destroy everything we've built. That boy, he needs to go away. Today." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the discussion. Mrs. Thompson entered, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richard, but there's an urgent call from the police station. They found an abandoned house in the area where the boy was found." Richard noticed his mother pale slightly. "I'll return the call later," he replied, without taking his eyes off Margaret. "They said it's very important," insisted Mrs. Thompson. "It seems the house belonged to a woman named Claire Sullivan." The name fell like a bomb in the office. Margaret stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. "You're not going to answer that call, Richard. Don't get involved in this." "Claire Sullivan," muttered Richard, a name that seemed to awaken something in his memory. "Who is she, Mother?" "Nobody." The answer came too quickly. "Just some woman. Just some woman who makes you tremble just hearing her name." Richard picked up the phone. "Mrs. Thompson, transfer the call here." "Richard!" Margaret's voice had a warning tone that he hadn't heard since adolescence. "If you answer that phone, there's no turning back." For a moment, mother and son stared at each other in silence. The tension was palpable in the air. Finally, Richard pressed the phone button. "Richard Morgan speaking," he said, maintaining a defiant look at his mother. From the other end of the line, the detective's voice sounded grave. "Mr. Morgan, we need you to come to the station. We found some documents in the house. Documents that mention your sister, Hannah Morgan." Richard saw his mother hastily leave the office, the door slamming hard behind her. From upstairs, he heard Lucas's frightened cry, probably awakened by the noise. The police station was an old building in the city center, with peeling walls that had seen better days. Richard followed Detective Robert Alvarez down a poorly lit corridor to a back room where several cardboard boxes were stacked. "We found all this in Claire Sullivan's house," explained Alvarez, opening one of the boxes. "They're mostly old documents, photos, letters, but there's something you need to see." The detective pulled out a yellowed envelope with moisture stains on the edges. Inside was a photo that made Richard's heart stop for a moment. Hannah, his sister, embracing a woman he didn't know, both smiling at the camera. The photo seemed to have been taken about 20 years ago. "The woman next to her is Claire Sullivan," said Alvarez. "And there's more." He handed Richard a leather-bound diary. The pages were filled with delicate and organized handwriting. Richard began to read randomly. March 20th, 2005. Hannah came to see me today. She's pregnant. Her father found out and threatened to take everything from her if she didn't do what he wants. But she's determined to keep the child. She said she won't let them do to her child what they did to her. Richard felt his blood run cold. What did they do to her? Keep reading, Alvarez gently instructed. March 25, 2005. The Morgans are more powerful than we imagined. They managed to block all of Hannah's accounts. She's scared, but she won't give up. I promise to help her hide until the baby is born. Richard flipped through a few more pages, his heart beating faster and faster. September 15th, 2005. The baby was born today. A beautiful boy, with the same eyes as his mother. Hannah is radiant. Despite everything, we decided to call him Lucas after her maternal grandfather. The diary slipped from Richard's hands. Lucas. The same Lucas who was now in his house, his nephew. There's one more thing you need to know, said Alvarez, hesitant. We found records of regular bank transfers to Claire Sullivan's account. All coming from an offshore company, controlled by Morgan Corporation. My family was paying to keep Hannah hidden, Richard asked, incredulous. Not exactly, replied the detective. The transfers started just 6 years ago, and they were authorized by someone inside the company, someone who had access to the family's secret funds. Richard sat heavily in a nearby chair. His head was spinning with the implications. Someone in the family not only knew where Hannah had been all this time, but was also financing her silence. There's one more thing, continued Alvarez, picking up another envelope. We found this hidden in a false drawer in Claire's house. It's a letter addressed to you, dated 3 weeks ago. With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. The handwriting was different from the diaries, more urgent and irregular. Dear brother, if you're reading this, something has happened to me or Claire. There's so much I need to tell you, so many secrets that need to come to light. But the most important thing is Lucas. He is my son, your nephew, and he's in danger. Our father wasn't the man we thought, Richard. The family empire was built on lies and betrayals. Claire has all the evidence, all the documents. Please protect my son. Don't let them do to him what they did to me. With love, Hannah. Richard let the letter fall on the table, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. His mother's words that morning now made a terrible sense. Her desperation to send Lucas away, the fear of the truth coming to light. Mr. Morgan, the detective's voice brought him back to reality. There's one more thing you need to know. Claire Sullivan was last seen 3 weeks ago, shortly after posting this letter. And we found evidence that someone had been searching for something in her house, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Upon returning to the mansion, Richard found a scenario he didn't expect. His older brother, Andrew Morgan, was in the entrance hall, talking in a low voice with Margaret. The two fell silent abruptly when they saw him. "Ricky!" exclaimed Andrew, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mum told me about our little guest." Richard studied his brother cautiously. Andrew was the chairman of the board of Morgan Corporation, a position he inherited from their father. Always impeccably dressed in his Italian suits, he personified the image of the successful executive. But there was something in his eyes at that moment, a calculating gleam that Richard knew well from the most tense business meetings. "Where's the boy?" asked Richard, ignoring the false cordiality. "Mrs. Thompson took him for a walk in the gardens," Margaret replied quickly. "Andrew came to help us resolve this situation." "What situation, exactly?" questioned Richard, keeping his voice controlled. "The situation of us having abandoned Hannah, or the situation of us having paid to keep her hidden all these years?" Andrew paled slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Richard took a step forward. "I just got back from the police station. They found Claire Sullivan's house, and with it, a very interesting story about our family." Margaret let out a small groan, leaning on the stair railing. Andrew, on the other hand, maintained his composure, only adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture. "Richard," he began, using his most diplomatic tone, "there are things that happened in the past, difficult decisions that had to be made for the good of the family." "What decisions? What good?" Richard practically spat the words. "Hannah was pregnant, Andrew, pregnant. And you expelled her, forced her to hide like a criminal. It wasn't quite like that, intervened Margaret, her voice trembling. Your father, he was trying to protect her. Protect her from what? The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew and Margaret exchanged tense looks, as if waging a silent battle over what to reveal. At that moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Dr. Sanders. Preliminary results confirm kinship. The boy has genetic markers compatible with your family. Complete analysis in 24 hours. Lucas is indeed Hannah's son, said Richard, putting the phone away. My nephew. And you knew it all along. Richard, please, Andrew took a step in his direction. We need to think calmly. The press can't know about this. The scandal would destroy the company. Years of work. The company? Richard laughed, humorlessly. Is that all you're worried about? Our sister disappeared for 20 years and you're worried about the company's stocks? Don't be naive. Andrew raised his voice. You have no idea what's at stake here. There are things about Hannah, about her father. Her father? Richard frowned. What do you mean by that? Margaret let out a muffled sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Andrew closed his eyes, as if he had said something he shouldn't have. Nothing, he cut off dryly. Forget what I said. But Richard wasn't willing to let it go. 20 years of lies were enough. Her father? Hannah is my sister, Andrew. We have the same father. No. Margaret's voice sounded weak, almost a whisper. You don't. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Richard looked at his mother, then at Andrew, searching for some sign that this was another lie, but the downcast eyes of both confirmed the shocking truth. Who? Richard began, but was interrupted by a scream coming from the gardens. Mr. Richard! Mrs. Thompson's voice sounded panicked. The boy! Someone took the boy! Chaos ensued in the mansion in the following minutes. Richard ran to the gardens, followed by Andrew and some security guards. They found Mrs. Thompson in tears, pointing to the back of the property. I only got distracted for a second, she sobbed. A black car stopped there by the fence. 2 men got out and grabbed Lucas. He screamed, but it was so fast. Richard felt the blood boil in his veins. He turned to confront Andrew and his mother, who were observing the scene with unreadable expressions. Was it you? He asked, his voice laden with contained fury. Did you send them to take my nephew? Richard, be reasonable, Andrew raised, his hands in an appeasing gesture. Why would we do that? To bury the truth like you always have. Richard advanced threateningly against his brother, being restrained by the security guards. Where did you take him? Enough! Margaret's voice cut through the air like a whip. No one here had anything to do with this, but maybe it's better this way. Better? Richard shook off the security guards. I'm calling the police right now. No! It was Andrew who shouted this time. If you do that, there's no turning back. Think carefully, brother. Some truths need to stay buried. Richard stopped, a sudden understanding hitting him. You know who took Lucas, don't you? Andrew's silence was answer enough. Richard took out his cell phone, but before he could dial, a new message from Dr. Sanders appeared on the screen. Complementary analysis revealed something unexpected. The boy has genetic markers that correspond not only to your family, but specifically to you. The compatibility suggests direct kinship. We need to talk urgently. Richard felt the world spin. Direct kinship. Could it be possible that Lucas wasn't his nephew, but rather... What did you do? He muttered, looking at his mother and Andrew. What did you do to Hannah? Margaret staggered, needing to lean on Andrew. You don't understand, son. Your father, when he found out about Hannah and Claire... Claire? Richard frowned. What does Claire have to do with this? Claire Sullivan was more than Hannah's friend, Andrew finally spoke. They were together. Dad couldn't accept that, not with all the conservatism of our investors, the traditional families, so he expelled her because of that. No, Margaret sobbed. It was worse than that. Hannah, she discovered something about your father's business, documents that proved embezzlement, fraud. She threatened to expose everything if he didn't, except her relationship with Claire. Richard felt bile rise in his throat. And what did he do? He set a trap, Andrew continued, his voice trembling. He forged documents, made it look like Hannah was involved in illegal schemes. She had to flee, or she would face years in prison. And you allowed this? Richard barely recognized his own voice. We had no choice, Andrew defended himself. The entire company would fall if the truth came out. Thousands of jobs, decades of history. But that doesn't explain Lucas. The DNA test. Margaret sank onto a garden bench, seeming to age years in seconds. Hannah was pregnant when she fled, but it wasn't just that. She had discovered... Richard, you and Hannah, you... The sound of an engine interrupted the confession. A car was approaching at high speed along the mansion's driveway. When it stopped, a figure Richard hadn't seen in 20 years but would recognize anywhere, stepped out. Hannah Morgan was back. Hannah Morgan looked different from the portraits Richard kept in his memory. Her hair, once long and dark, was now short and peppered with white strands. But her eyes, those same intense eyes he now recognized in Lucas. "Where is my son?" she demanded, ignoring Margaret's cries and Andrew's paleness. Richard took a step in her direction but stopped, unsure. 20 years of absence weighed between them like an invisible wall. "Hannah, I'm sorry. Someone took him. It just happened." "I know exactly who took him," she replied, her eyes fixed on Andrew. "It wasn't a coincidence you showed up here today, was it, brother?" Andrew adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed him. "Hannah, be reasonable. The boy is safe, just protected." "Protected?" Hannah laughed bitterly. "Like I was protected all these years, or like Claire was protected when she tried to find me." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened to Claire? Why don't you ask our dear brother?" Hannah advanced towards Andrew. "He's been monitoring my every move for the past 20 years, paying Claire to keep me hidden, and when she finally decided to tell the truth..." "Enough!" Margaret's voice cut through the air like a razor. "You don't understand. Everything we did was to protect this family." "Family?" Hannah turned to her mother. "What family, Mom? The one Dad built on lies, or the one you maintained with bribes and threats?" Richard observed the confrontation, his mind working furiously to connect the pieces. "Hannah," he called softly, "why did the DNA test show that Lucas has a direct connection to me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah closed her eyes as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, they were misty. "Because he's your son, Richard." The world seemed to stop. Richard felt the air escape from his lungs. How is that possible?" "Remember that New Year's Eve party 20 years ago?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "When you drank too much and woke up the next day not remembering anything?" Richard felt his legs weaken. He vaguely remembered that night, drinking beyond his limit to forget a romantic disappointment. The rest was a blur. "You weren't drunk," Hannah continued. "Dad put something in your drink. It was part of his plan." "What plan?" Richard barely recognized his own voice. "The plan to destroy me." Hannah wiped away a tear. "He found out about me and Claire, discovered that I had evidence of his embezzlements in the company, so he orchestrated the perfect revenge to make it look like My God!" Richard staggered, leaning against a column. "Is that why you ran away?" "I was already pregnant when I found out what he had done," Hannah sobbed. "Claire helped me escape, hid me. I couldn't let them take my baby away from me. Couldn't let them use Lucas as another piece in Dad's sick game." Margaret, who had been observing in silence until then, took a step forward. "Your father did what needed to be done. The family..." "The family?" Hannah exploded. "He destroyed the family. He drugged his own son, manipulated all of us like chess pieces, and you helped cover it all up." "Where is Lucas?" Richard asked Andrew, his voice dangerously calm. "Where did you send my son?" Andrew hesitated, his gaze alternating between Hannah and Richard. "He's in a safe place with trusted people. It's temporary until we resolve." He didn't finish the sentence. Richard grabbed him by the lapel of his Italian suit, pushing him against the wall. "Where is my son?" "At the country house." Andrew raised his hands in surrender. At the country house of Vincent, my assistant. But Richard, you don't understand. There's more at stake here. Dad left specific instructions in case something like this happened. What instructions? Hannah approached, alarmed. A will, Margaret answered, her voice weak. Your father modified the will before he passed away. If the truth about Lucas came to light, all control of the company would pass to an independent board of directors. We would lose everything. Richard released Andrew, taking a step back. And you think I care about that? About money, about the company? It's not just the company. Andrew straightened his crumpled suit. It's the jobs, the families that depend on us, the social projects, all the legacy we've built. Legacy? Hannah laughed bitterly. Dad's legacy of lies? The lives he destroyed? The shady businesses that... A message sound interrupted the confrontation. It was Richard's cell phone. His hands were trembling when he read, Mr. Richard, I tried to call but couldn't reach you. I need to inform you of something serious about the DNA test. There's one more match you need to know. Richard stared fixedly at the message on his cell phone, feeling the weight of 2 decades of lies crashing down on his shoulders. Dr. Sanders had found something else in the tests, something that could change everything again. What is it? Asked Hannah, noticing his disturbance. Before he could answer, a familiar car entered through the mansion gates. Vincent Costa's black Mercedes, Andrew's closest assistant. The man who was supposedly keeping Lucas at his country house. What is he doing here? Questioned Richard, turning to Andrew. You said Lucas was with him. Vincent got out of the car with a grave expression. In his hands, he carried an old leather folder. Mr. Andrew, he said, ignoring the others present, something unexpected happened. Mr. Morgan's safe. Someone opened it. Andrew paled. Impossible. Only my father had the combination. And Claire, interrupted Hannah, making everyone turn to her. Claire knew the combination. That's how we got the evidence of the embezzlements 20 years ago. Vincent cleared his throat, uncomfortable. We found this inside the safe, he said, extending the folder. I believe everyone here needs to see it. With trembling hands, Andrew opened the folder. Inside were documents yellowed by time, old photos, and a sealed letter. One of the photos fell to the ground. It showed the Morgan patriarch still young next to a woman no one recognized. Margaret let out a muffled groan. No! He promised he had destroyed everything. What are you talking about, Mom? Demanded Hannah. Your father, Margaret began, her voice failing. He wasn't who everyone thought. Before he met me, he had another family. Richard picked up the photo from the ground, studying it carefully. The unknown woman had familiar features. Features he saw in the mirror every day. The woman in the photo, continued Margaret, is your real mother, Richard. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked from the photo to Margaret, his world crumbling once again. This is impossible, he muttered. It's not, replied Vincent, pulling more documents from the folder. Your father kept records of everything. Richard, you're not Margaret's son. You're the son of Regina Sullivan. Sullivan? Hannah interrupted, her eyes wide. Like Claire. Sullivan? Vincent nodded gravely. Claire was your aunt, Richard, sister of your biological mother. The implications of this revelation hit everyone like a wave. Hannah staggered, leaning on a chair. That's why Claire helped me, she whispered. That's why she risked so much. She was protecting her own nephew. And Lucas? Asked Richard, his voice trembling. If I'm not a Morgan, then how? The DNA test, interrupted Andrew, frantically leafing through the documents. There was another match because, my God. What? Demanded Hannah. Lucas isn't Richard's son, said Andrew, raising his eyes from the papers. He's Claire's son. Hannah shook her head, confused. No, that's impossible. I'm Lucas's mother. I carried him. Claire was your biological mother, Hannah. Margaret's voice sounded defeated. Your father, he discovered that Regina, Richard's mother, had a sister who couldn't have children. So he arranged everything. He used the family's money and influence to forge documents, swap babies in the maternity ward. So Lucas, Richard tried to process the information. Is your cousin, completed Vincent, son of Claire Sullivan with Hannah. The world seemed to spin around them. Decades of lies, lives manipulated like pieces in a perverse game. Everything was starting to make a terrible sense. "Where is my son?" Hannah's voice cut through the silence, laden with contained fury. "Where is Lucas?" Vincent exchanged a nervous look with Andrew. "He's not at the country house. He's—" A scream from the mansion interrupted his sentence. Mrs. Thompson appeared at the door, breathless. "Mrs. Margaret, it's the police. They found Claire Sullivan." Claire Sullivan was alive. The news fell like a bomb among those present in the Morgan Mansion gardens. According to Mrs. Thompson, the police had found her in a private hospital on the outskirts of New York, admitted under a false name. "Who?" asked Hannah, turning to Andrew. "Who put her there?" Andrew raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "I had nothing to do with it. I swear." "It was my order." Margaret's voice sounded firm, making everyone turn to her. The Morgan matriarch was different now. The air of fragility had given way to a hard, calculating expression. Claire knew too much. She was threatening to expose everything. "So you—" Richard felt bile rise in his throat. "I kept her sedated," Margaret completed, showing no remorse. "It was necessary. She was going to destroy everything we built." "My God," Hannah covered her mouth with her hands. "You're a monster." "I'm a survivor," Margaret retorted. "You think it was easy? Keeping up appearances all these years? Protecting the family name, ensuring your future?" "Future?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You destroyed our lives. Manipulated, lied, separated families." "I gave you what you needed." Margaret raised her voice. "Richard, do you think you would have gotten where you are if they knew your origins? And you, Hannah, do you think society would accept your condition?" "My condition?" Hannah advanced threateningly. "The fact that I love a woman? Or the fact that she's my real mother?" Vincent, who had remained silent, cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a final document from the folder. "Something we found along with the other papers in the safe. It was an old USB drive, the kind hardly seen anymore. Along with it was a yellowed note, handwritten, 'For Richard and Hannah, the truth you deserve to know.' It's Dad's handwriting," recognized Andrew, his voice trembling. Richard connected the USB drive to his cell phone using an adapter. A single video file appeared on the screen. When play was pressed, the face of the Morgan patriarch filled the small screen. "My children," he began, looking aged and tired. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer here and the truth has finally come to light. There's so much I need to confess." The video continued, revealing an even more complex web of lies than they had imagined. The patriarch confessed how he met Regina Sullivan, how he fell in love with her, how he was forced by his own family to abandon her while pregnant to marry Margaret, an arranged union to unite two powerful families. But Regina had a sister, he continued in the video, Claire, who couldn't have children. When Hannah was born, it was Margaret's idea to swap the babies, forge documents. It was a way to ensure that Morgan blood remained pure in the eyes of society. Richard paused the video, unable to continue watching. The silence in the garden was sepulchral. "Where is Lucas?" he finally asked, facing Margaret. "The truth now." The matriarch held his gaze for a long moment before responding. "In the same hospital as Claire. I thought it would be safer to keep them together." "You had no right," Hannah exploded. "I had every right," Margaret shot back. "I was the one who kept this family together. I was the one who protected you from yourselves." "Enough," Richard's voice sounded dangerously calm. "Enough of lies, enough of manipulation. It's over, Mum. Or rather, Mrs. Morgan." At that moment, sirens began to sound in the distance, approaching the mansion. Vincent checked his cell phone. "The police," he said. "They're coming here. Claire, she woke up, and she's talking." Margaret staggered, needing to lean on Andrew. Her mask of strength was finally starting to crack. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If this comes to light, it won't just be the end of the Morgans. Other families are involved, other secret—" "I don't care," Richard cut her off. "I don't care how many traditional families fall, how many empires crumble. I just want my son back." "Our son," Hannah gently corrected. "He's as much yours as he is mine, Richard. Blood of our blood." The sirens were closer now. Red and blue lights began to reflect off the high walls of the mansion. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no going back. St. Luke's Hospital was an imposing building in the southern part of New York. Richard and Hannah walked through its white and aseptic corridors side by side, escorted by police officers. Detective Alvarez accompanied them personally after the tumultuous events at the Morgan mansion. Margaret had been taken to give a statement, along with Andrew and Vincent. The matriarch maintained her haughty posture until the end, even when the handcuffs closed around her wrists. "Everything I did was for you," were her last words before entering the police car. In room 507, Claire Sullivan was sitting on the bed, looking fragile but conscious. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw Hannah. "My daughter," she whispered, extending her arms. Hannah ran to embrace her, sobbing. Richard observed the scene with a heavy heart, thinking of Regina, his real mother, who never had the chance to embrace him like that. "Lucas is in the next room," Claire informed after the first moments of emotion had passed. "They kept him sedated like me, but he's fine. He's sleeping now." Richard and Hannah exchanged looks. "Let's see him together," Hannah decided, holding her brother's hand. Lucas looked small and vulnerable in the hospital bed, but his face was serene. When Hannah gently touched his face, he opened his eyes. "Mom," he murmured sleepily. Then he saw Richard and smiled. "I knew you would find me." Richard felt tears streaming down his face. "Always, son, I'll always find you." In the weeks that followed, the truth came out like an avalanche. The press had a field day with the Morgan scandal. Other traditional families were dragged into the whirlwind, as Margaret had predicted. Empires crumbled, fortunes changed hands, reputations were destroyed. Morgan Corporation survived, but completely transformed. The independent board took over, as determined by the patriarch's will, but with a significant change. Richard and Hannah were named special consultants, with the mission of restructuring the company under new values of transparency and ethics. Claire fully recovered and helped the police unravel the entire web of lies and manipulations. Her strength and dignity inspired many to face their own family secrets. On a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the events that changed their lives, Richard watched Lucas playing in the garden of their new home, a smaller and more welcoming property than the old mansion. Hannah was by his side, and Claire watched them from the porch. "Sometimes I wonder," Hannah said softly, "if Dad regretted it in the end. If that's why he left that video." "I think so," replied Richard. "He understood that some truths can't stay buried forever, and that real family isn't built on lies." Lucas ran up to them, holding something in his hands. "Look what I found," he exclaimed, showing a small crescent-shaped stone. Richard and Hannah smiled. The birthmark that had connected them was now a symbol of their union, no longer a secret, to be hidden. "You know, Lucas," said Hannah, hugging her son, "sometimes families are like puzzles. Some pieces might be in the wrong place for a long time, but when they finally find their true place, they fit perfectly," completed Richard. Lucas looked at both of them, his eyes shining with the simple wisdom of children. "Like us?" "Yes, son." Richard ruffled his hair affectionately. "Exactly like us." On the porch, Claire observed the scene with tears in her eyes. The past had been painful, but the present was a gift. Regina, her sister, would be proud to see her family finally united, finally true. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden hues. A new era was beginning for the Morgans, no longer a dynasty built on secrets and manipulations, but a family rebuilt on the foundations of love, truth, and acceptance. Lucas ran back to the garden, his laughter echoing in the afternoon air. Richard and Hannah watched him, their hearts full of a joy that no fortune could buy. They were finally home. They were finally complete. The wind blew gently, carrying the last leaves of autumn. With them went the final remnants of the secrets that had imprisoned them for so long. The future lay before them, bright and full of Possibilities like a blank page waiting to be written, this time with the indelible ink of truth. As the evening settled in, Richard, Hannah, and Claire gathered on the porch, watching Lucas play with his newfound treasure, the crescent-shaped stone. The air was filled with a sense of peace that none of them had felt in decades. "You know," Claire began, her voice soft with reflection, "for years I dreamed of this moment. All of us together, free from the lies. But I never truly believed it would happen." Hannah reached out and squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm sorry it took so long, Mom. If I had known—" "No," Claire shook her head firmly. "You did what you had to do to protect Lucas, just as I did what I had to do to protect you both. We can't change the past, but we can shape our future." Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on Lucas. "And that's exactly what we're going to do. No more secrets, no more lies. From now on, we face everything together, as a family." As night fell, they moved inside. Lucas, tired from his day of exploration, fell asleep quickly in Hannah's arms. As she carried him to bed, Richard and Claire found themselves alone in the living room. "Claire," Richard began hesitantly, "I want you to know I'm grateful. For everything you did for Hannah, for Lucas, for keeping them safe when I couldn't." Claire's eyes welled with tears. "Oh, Richard, you have so much of Regina in you. She would be so proud of the man you've become." "Tell me about her," Richard said softly. "Please, I want to know everything." And so, as the night deepened, Claire shared stories of Regina, her kindness, her strength, her unwavering love for the son she never got to raise. With each tale, Richard felt a piece of himself falling into place, a connection to a past he'd never known but had always been a part of him. Meanwhile, in her old cell at the county jail, Margaret Morgan sat alone, staring at the blank wall before her. The empire she had fought so hard to protect had crumbled, but oddly, she felt a sense of relief. The weight of decades of secrets had finally lifted from her shoulders. A guard appeared at her cell door. "Mrs. Morgan, you have a visitor." To her surprise, Andrew walked in. He looked different, humbled almost. The polished exterior of the corporate shark was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in just a few months. "Mother," he said, sitting across from her, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what conclusions have you come to?" Andrew sighed deeply. "That we were wrong. All of it. The lies, the manipulation. We lost sight of what really mattered." For a moment, Margaret felt a flash of her old anger, the instinct to defend their actions. But as quickly as it came, it faded away. "Perhaps you're right," she admitted quietly. "But it's too late now." "Is it?" Andrew leaned forward. "Richard and Hannah, they're rebuilding the company. On honesty, on integrity, they've offered me a chance to be a part of it." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "After everything?" Andrew nodded. "They say it's time to heal, to move forward. Mother, I think I want to try, to be better, to be the kind of person Lucas can look up to." As Margaret absorbed this, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. "Then do it," she said firmly. "Be better than we were. Make amends." As Andrew left, Margaret turned back to the blank wall. But this time, instead of emptiness, she saw possibility. The chance for a new chapter, even if it was written from behind bars. Back at the new Morgan home, Hannah joined Richard and Claire in the living room, having put Lucas to bed. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point. "You know," Hannah said after a while, "I keep thinking about Dad's video, why he decided to record it, why he kept it hidden all those years." Richard nodded thoughtfully. I think in the end, he realized the weight of what he'd done. The lives he'd altered. Maybe this was his way of trying to make it right, even if he couldn't face the consequences himself. "Do you think we can ever forgive him?" Hannah asked softly. Claire took a deep breath. "Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. We don't have to decide right now. What matters is that we're here, together, moving forward." As the night wore on, they shared more stories, laughed, and even cried a little. They talked about the future, about raising Lucas with honesty and love, about rebuilding the company on a foundation of integrity, about healing the wounds of the past. In the early hours of the morning, as Claire and Hannah said their goodnights and headed to bed, Richard found himself alone in the living room. He walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. The drive for success that had consumed him for so long was still there, but it had transformed. Now it was a desire to build something meaningful, something that would make his biological mother, and the man he had thought was his father, proud. As he turned to head to bed, his eye caught a framed photo on the mantel. It was a new one. Richard, Hannah, Claire and Lucas, all smiling at the camera during a recent picnic. Next to it stood the crescent-shaped stone Lucas had found. Richard picked up the stone, turning it over in his hand. Like this stone, their family had been shaped by time and pressure, hidden in the dark for so long. But now they had emerged into the light, their true beauty finally revealed. He placed the stone back next to the photo and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that they had truly changed. But for now, in this quiet moment, Richard Morgan knew one thing for certain. They were no longer a family built on secrets and lies. They were a family rebuilt on truth, forgiveness, and love. And that, he realized, was the greatest fortune of all. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Richard felt a sense of anticipation for the future. Not the anxious, driven anticipation of his past, but a calm, hopeful one. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family.